Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this fascinating conversation about diversity of innovation and how to expand the innovation ecosystem in the United States and, frankly, around the world. Thanks to CSIS for hosting us, and really welcome to everybody on our live program, as well as folks watching us over Zoom. Since the founding of this great nation, innovation has been the driving force of our economy and our most defining trait as a people. Unfortunately, however, innovation in the United States is highly concentrated. It's concentrated demographically, economically, and geographically. For example, women account for more than half, or approximately half, of our national workforce, but only about 13% of inventors named on US patents, according to a US PTO report from 2020. For the United States to maintain its edge in an increasingly competitive global economy, this must change. Likewise, racial minorities make an even smaller percentage of inventors named on US patents. And in addition to all that, innovation is concentrated geographically in the United States in just a handful of cities around the country, frankly, mostly on the coasts. All of those things need to change. Because recent studies show that by harnessing the creative talent of all Americans, we could quadruple the number of inventors and increase our overall GDP in the United States per capita by over 4%. Not only does such participation benefit the United States economy, but also the individuals themselves, who benefit greatly from personal growth, career advancement, and so forth. For example, workers in IP-intensive industries make an average that is almost 50% higher than those in other industries in the private sector. Needless to say, innovation and intellectual property benefits the companies inventors work in. For example, approval of a startup's first patent, and that's just the first patent, increases the employment growth for the startup in the next 5 years by a remarkable 50%. In short, expanding the innovation ecosystem is one of our nation's best and most tangible opportunities, most immediate opportunity for enhancing economic growth and improving the standard of living and the quality of life of all Americans. So I say, let's all go do that. But the question is how? I think we need concrete proposals. And to do that, we need to have a detailed study or studies to understand what are the specific issues and how should we go about fixing them. Along with other work streams, we are studying this issue in particular here at CSIS, and today's meeting is part of that effort. It promises to be a fascinating conversation. I will discuss specific proposals live with a great panel of experts in about 20 minutes or so. But first, we will hear a keynote from Senator Hirono, after which the Senator and I will engage in a short conversation, after which I will return live to introduce our panel. So with that, let me ask the folks at CSIS to play the keynote from Senator Hirono.
I would like to thank CSIS for hosting this event and inviting me to speak on the importance of increasing diversity in our innovation economy. Women and racial minorities have made some of the most significant inventions in history. Can you imagine driving a car without windshield wipers? Invented by Mary Anderson in 1903. What would we do without the home security system? Invented by Marie Van Britten Brown in 1966. the genetic revolution would still be science fiction, if not for the CRISPR gene editing tool discovered by Jennifer Doudna, raised on Hawaii Island. We should celebrate these diverse inventors and the many others who have contributed to innovation in this country. But we must also recognize the hard truth that women and minorities are greatly underrepresented in the U.S. patent system. The Patent and Trademark Office's 2020 report on women inventors found that only 22% of U.S. patents list a woman as an inventor, and that women make up only 13% of all inventors. For comparison, women held 48% of all full-time jobs in 2019. Even if we focus on the STEM careers most likely to generate patents, we still see a gap. Women made up approximately 27% of the STEM workforce in 2019, a number that greatly exceeds the 13% of inventors that are women. Racial patent gaps also exist. For example, a report by the Institute for Women's Policy Research found that the percentage of African American and Hispanic college graduates who hold patents is approximately half that of their white counterparts. Closing these gaps would turbocharge our economy. According to a study by the Michigan State University professor Lisa Cook, including more women and Black Americans in the initial stages of innovation could increase GDP by as much as $640 billion. Another study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that eliminating the patent gap for women with science and engineering degrees alone would increase GDP by over $500 billion. It's simply good policy and good business to make our innovation economy accessible to all. Thankfully, both Congress and the PTO have taken steps to start addressing these patent gaps. In 2018, Congress passed the Success Act, a bill I co-sponsored that directed the PTO to study the number of patents applied for and obtained by women, minorities, and veterans. The PTO's subsequent report contained a number of suggestions we can take to address the underrepresentation of these groups. The PTO also launched its National Council for Expanding American Innovation, an initiative tasked with guiding the PTO in developing a comprehensive national strategy to build a more diverse and inclusive innovation ecosystem. I look forward to seeing the results of the Council's work. But even with these efforts, there's much more we can and should do. This is why I introduced the Inventor Diversity for Economic Advancement, or IDEA Act, earlier this year. This bipartisan legislation comes from a recommendation in the Success Act report and would direct the PTO to collect demographic data from patent applicants on a voluntary basis. This would give us greater insight into whatever gaps exist and how to best address them. The bill received bipartisan support in the Senate Judiciary Committee and was incorporated into the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act earlier this year. I look forward to the House passing the bill so the PTO can start collecting this critical data. Last year, Senators Tillis and Coons joined me in a letter to PTO Director Yanku, who I look forward to speaking with shortly, asking the PTO to look into the underrepresentation of women in the patent bar. I'm glad to say the PTO responded by taking steps to expand automatic qualification to the patent bar. This will make the patent bar more accessible, including to diverse candidates without impacting patent quality. I fully expect the increased diversity in the patent bar to drive increased diversity in the inventors we see apply for patents. We should encourage more women to pursue STEM careers. Earlier this year, I introduced two bills, the STEM Opportunities Act and the Women and Minorities in STEM Booster Act, aimed at improving the recruitment, retention, and success of women and minorities in the STEM pipeline. I will work to make sure these bills become law. These are just a few steps we can take to increase diversity in our innovation economy, not just because it's the right thing, but because America needs the skills and talents of all its people if we want to maintain our place as the world's leading innovator. Mahalo and aloha to all of you.
Thank you very much, Senator Hirono, for the excellent keynote. And before we go to the Q&A, let me take just a minute to properly introduce the senator. Senator Hirono was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2012 from Hawaii. She is the first Asian American, Asian immigrant to serve in the Senate, and she's the first woman to represent the state of Hawaii in the Senate. Senator Hirono previously served in the U.S. House of Representatives before coming to the Senate. The senator was born in a village near Fukushima, Japan, and then immigrated with her family to Honolulu in 1955. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Hawaii, has a law degree from Georgetown University. She has worked for the state government, by the way, in antitrust litigation. And very often that is related at times to intellectual property. But then after that, she ran and then served in the Hawaii House of Representatives. She also ran and won the post of lieutenant governor. The senator is a member of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Intellectual Property, obviously a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee overall, and is a great contributor to intellectual property policy issues in the United States. So with that, I had the opportunity to speak with the senator about these very important issues a few days ago.
Hello, Senator, and so great to be with you again. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of our program here at CSIS on diversity of innovation. I was so pleased to hear you talk about women inventors and specific examples of women inventors, because all inventors, especially would-be inventors, need role models. So being able to identify specific individuals that up-and-coming inventors can look up to and see themselves in them, I find that to be so important. Do you find that you often talk about individuals, and what do you think that does for the innovation economy?
Any endeavor where there are very few women or minorities would benefit from having women and minorities be out front and be role models. I think it makes a huge difference. And of course, in my life, way back when, there weren't that many women lawyers. In fact, I didn't know anybody my own age from my group that had gone to law school. So it really helped when I met some people who were my age who had done that. So it's not as though we need to bow down to these people, but it's good to see that there are people who look like us, who have the backgrounds like us, who are doing, who are in the STEM fields. It's really important.
So what more can we do as leaders in this field to highlight these individuals? You know, there's so much in the debates about patents and IP in general. There seems to be so much negativity about, you know, whether we're talking about patent trolls or patent thickets or a whole host of issues, some of which need to be addressed. But in this sea of seemingly never-ending pejoratives, what do you think we can do more to highlight the successes of these great inventors that have come before us?
Oh, certainly to talk about them, to make sure that they are when we read books about them. For example, I am about in the middle of the Code Breakers book about Jennifer Doudna, one of the co-inventors, I guess is co-inventors of the CRISPR gene modification. And what's really great is I know that she graduated from Hilo High School in Hawaii. So for all of Hawaii students, and especially women and minorities, to see somebody like Jennifer doing what she's doing is important. So we should talk about it. We should read the books about them. That's one of the ways. But in addition, as you know, I have introduced some legislation that will provide grants and other kinds of support for women and minorities in STEM, because women and minorities drop out of the STEM environment at all levels, from elementary, secondary, clearly in the profession, because they need I would say a lot more support and attention being paid to their talents and skills.
And you also introduced fairly recently the IDEA Act. Can you talk a bit about that and what's the purpose behind that legislation?
This was a bipartisan bill with Senator Tillis, and all it did was to enable the Patent and Trademark Office to collect in a voluntary basis demographic data of the people who are applying for patents, so that we have a much clearer picture of who's applying for patents and some of the other kinds of information that will enable us to see where the gaps may be in terms of who's applying for patents, who's getting patents. And there's nothing like data to inform where we need to go. You would think that this would be a very simple bill, but it generated quite a lot of debate in the Judiciary Committee. But it did pass out of the Judiciary Committee in a bipartisan vote, and it has passed the Senate. It was incorporated into I keep forgetting that the competition bill, anyway, it's the big competition bill, which passed the Senate on a bipartisan vote, and it is awaiting action in the House. So I hope that will happen. But really, it's just a voluntary collection of data that will enable us to see what we can support, particularly women and minorities in this field.
And I can't emphasize enough how important the data is in industry. So for companies to be able to understand what the issue is and then direct resources to solving that issue, and then have a baseline against which to measure their record and success, and then make changes if changes need to be made in their program. Without the data, it is very difficult to even get going to address these problems.
Exactly. And when you headed up the Patent and Trademark Office, you took some initiatives to gather data. And so we know that that women and minorities are not generally patent holders. So we are losing, I would say, a tremendous amount of talent in our country. And if we intend to continue to be leaders in innovation and creativity, then if we lose the brain power and skills and talents of practically half of our population, we are really shooting ourselves in the foot. So having recognized that, though, that it doesn't change if we just hope that it will change. We can actually take specific actions to gather more data, to provide grant and other kinds of support to enable women and minorities in particular to get into the patent fields and the STEM fields.
Now, as part of being part of the US, I guess it's called US Innovation and Competition Act, USICA, a much bigger package, waiting action in the House, which, as we all know, legislation can get bogged down, especially in big packages. What do you think the prospects of that passing are, or maybe should it be separated again into its own bill, or find a different vehicle for something like this?
That bill has bipartisan support. It did in the Senate, and so it has the bipartisan support. I think it's a matter of scheduling for the House, because we're very focused on the bills that we need to be focused on: the American Family Plan, Build Back Better plan, as well as the infrastructure plan. So those are massive bills that will help our communities. It's really transformational. So those are in the immediate horizon, but my hope and expectation is that the innovation and competition bill will be dealt with in the House early next year.
Great.
If not this year.
Another important component of diversity relates to geography. And what are your thoughts about policies that support inventors and bright minds in diverse geography of the United States, including your home state, Hawaii, or Idaho, or even Puerto Rico, just across the landscape? I know the Innovation and Competition Act has some provisions for regional hubs, but can you talk a bit about the importance of diversity in geography in innovation?
I think when you talk about the need for diversity, yes, of course, geographic diversity. A place like Hawaii, we don't necessarily get venture capital interest and all of that, except that I know for a fact that there are many, many talented people all across the country in rural areas, et cetera. So we need to pay attention to the kind of support we can provide to minority granting institutions of higher learning, and you know, those kinds of approaches, I think, will bear fruit. So that's where, again, data is important. If it's shown that there are geographic disparities and the kind of opportunities that will enable someone to get into the STEM fields, stay in the STEM fields, and become inventors, then that will inform where the resources should go.
Let me just ask one more question. I know time is very short. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office started a national council for expanding American innovation, specifically to look at all of these issues of diversity of innovation, and created a national plans, a proposal for expanding innovation. Mm-hmm. You being such a great leader on all of these issues, what do you think Congress can do to help accelerate a national plan like this, or to help accelerate such a program?
As I said, I have several bills to support mentors, to support grants, particularly for institutions, to provide grants. The National Institute of Science, for example, to provide grants to those institutions that can focus on encouraging more women and minorities to get into the STEM field. So those are very specific things we can do. I think the Patent and Trademark Office also has an important role to play. I remember going to one of the Smithsonian museums where the PTO was doing a hands-on kind of like a science fair type of experience for the kids, the young people who were going to to experience that. I thought that was such a great idea for the Patent Office to do that kind of outreach. So once you decide that these are activities that can really interest and awaken that kind of interest in young people, then we all can do a lot more very specific things like that. And one thing that I want to mention for the Patent and Trademark Office is that their willingness to look at who gets into the patent bar, because there aren't that many women who get into the patent bar. And so I know the PTO is expanding the qualifications and the criteria. And I tell the story of the woman who invented spandex, and she couldn't get a male patent lawyer. I mean, all the lawyers she went to see to help her get a patent were males, and they just didn't give her much encouragement. They thought that the idea was whatever, not worthy, but she persevered, and she's now a billionaire. And that is why expanding the patent bar is also an important part of the encouragement that people can receive to pursue patents. So that's something that another part, as I say, of how we can widen and provide the kind of diversity that we should be going for.
Can't emphasize enough also how important that part is, because without a diversity of attorneys that work with all these inventors, it makes it that much more difficult for the diverse inventors themselves, as in the example you have given, to be able to bring their ideas to market and to obtain IP protection for it. Now, of course, the Patent Office has a long history of working with women. Clara Barton, in fact, was a patent clerk at the Patent Office before the Civil War, and was a meaningful influence on the patent office at that time and in the federal government. But so much more needs to be done. And I do want to let folks know that your letter that was addressed to me, really as to the patent office, maybe a year ago or less or so, was an important catalyst. Is this kind of leadership from Capitol Hill, I think that really can help spur discussions and the new ideas and bring about change. And in this example, change was affected as a result, but I still think a bit more can be done.
No, of course. There's always more to be done because today there are really such a small percentage of women and minorities who are patent holders. So we can only improve. I think only 1 out of 4 are women patent holders. So, you know, we've got 75% to go, I'd say.
Yeah, actually quite a bit less. I think only about 13% of inventors named in US patents are women.
Yes.
And there are plenty of studies that show that innovation can quadruple in the United States, quadruple, if women and minorities would increase their participation. So
exactly. And if we're going to talk about the economic impact, yes, when you talk about women, when we unleash their talents, it can have a huge multi-billion-dollar impact on GDP.
You know, I want to conclude, but I can't resist asking you one more last question. What was it about you personally and your background that got you interested in innovation and IP?
I've been very focused on the need to support women at all decision-making levels, and this is an area that I could focus on to make a difference if I could. And so I think creativity is really important at a time when change happens so fast. And creativity and art, we should call it STEAM because it's science, technology, engineering, art. I find art is very important to me, and that's a very creative endeavor. And that's an area that I have been, I pursue that myself just to keep myself on an even keel. But that's where creativity comes into me. Creativity is a huge part of us remaining competitive. And so it was very clear to me that the patent area was one area where yet another area where we were missing women and minorities in the field.
Well, thank you for your leadership on innovation, on IP, and thank you so much for being with us on this program.
Thank you. Aloha, everyone. Stay safe. Be kind. Be creative.
Well, welcome back live, everyone. And such an interesting conversation with the senator. Let me thank the senator one more time. Senator Hirono is a true leader when it comes to intellectual property, innovation, and in particular, the issue that we are discussing today, which is the diversity and inclusiveness of the innovation economy in the United States and around the world. So thank you, Senator Hirono, for everything you do for the innovation ecosystem. Now, let me introduce our live panel, and we'll engage in a hour-long discussion or so on these very issues. I do want to mention to the audience, if folks are interested, you can send questions in either through the chat or the Q&A options, and I'll try to address them as they come in. So let me first introduce the panel, then we'll start the discussion with them. No particular order. First, we have Valencia Martin Wallace. Valencia is Deputy Commissioner at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, where she has spent 29 years of her career. She began as an examiner at the Patent Office. She's been Deputy Commissioner for a while. Right now, Ms. Martin Wallace leads the USPTO's efforts related to international IP harmonization and oversees patent examining functions in technology centers that deal with communications, manufacturing, and medical devices. Ms. Martin Wallace is also the executive lead for the USPTO's National Council on Expanding American Innovation, where she heads a coalition of leaders in academia, industry, and government in developing a comprehensive national strategy to build a more diverse and inclusive innovation ecosystem. Dr. Cordell Hardy. Dr. Hardy is the Senior Vice President of Corporate R&D Operations at 3M. Dr. Hardy began his career serving as Senior Research Engineer and the Research Specialist, and then Laboratory Supervisor in the Stationery and Office Supplies Division at 3M, where he patented a new glue stick design that became a key 3M product. Maybe you can demonstrate that glue stick, Dr. Hardy, during the program. He went on to lead the technology development groups in the 3M home care and safety and graphics divisions, overseeing the research and development of countless home cleaning and personal safety products. Dr. Hardy then went on to serve as the global R&D manager for 3M's personal safety division and technical director of 3M's commercial services division. Currently, Dr. Hardy is responsible for the operations of 3M's corporate R&D enterprises, where he focuses on fostering a culture of collaboration and breaking structural and geographical barriers to hiring, succession, and coordination of 3M's global network of technical professionals. Lisa Jorgensen is the Deputy Director for General Patents and Technology at the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva, also known as WIPO, where she oversees the administration of the Patent Cooperation Treaty and various programs related to patent law and application. Importantly, Ms. Jorgensen was recently appointed as WIPO's first IP and gender champion. She has previously served as Group Vice President for IP and Licensing at ST Microelectronics, and Ms. Jorgensen also served as the Executive Director of the American Intellectual Property Law Association, AIPLA. Last but certainly not least is Lonnie Johnson, who is the President and founder of Johnson Research and Development, which is an R&D technology development company. Dr. Johnson began his career as a research engineer at Oak Ridge National Laboratory before joining the U.S. Air Force, where he served as acting chief of the Space Nuclear Power Safety Section at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In 1979, Dr. Johnson joined NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, where he worked on the Galileo mission to Jupiter. He went back to the Air Force, then back to JPL. Back at JPL, he worked on the Mars Observer project, and also on the Cassini project, which sent a probe towards Saturn. During his 9-year career at JPL, he received many achievement awards from NASA for his work on spacecraft system design. In 1989, Dr. Johnson formed his own engineering firm and licensed his most famous invention, the Super Soaker water gun, to Laramie Corporation. In short order, after that, the Super Soaker became the #1 selling toy in the United States. And I'm sure he will tell us all about that. And while Cordell demonstrates his glue stick, Lonnie, perhaps you can demonstrate your Super Soaker. But Dr. Johnson holds over 100 patents with many patents pending, and is the author of several publications on spacecraft power systems. Okay, so with that, I could go on and on about each one of our panelists, but with that, let me jump into our discussion, and let me start with Lonnie Johnson. Welcome, Lonnie. You are an inventor and also an entrepreneur. tell us a little bit about your personal background and what is it? And you can go back as far as you want to childhood and whatnot. What is it that that brought you to become an inventor and entrepreneur?
Well, thank you for the introduction. For as long as I can remember, I've always been interested in how things worked. And from being a small child, I was always taking toys apart, my toys, my sisters and brothers' toys, and was always curious. My father taught me how to repair appliances around the house, simple things like fixing the power cord on a light lamp, for example. And I just continued that interest. And by the time I got into high school, I was really, really serious about becoming an engineer. I wanted to be an engineer even before I knew it was called engineering. So I wanted to share a picture with you of me in high school. I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is me in 1968. I built a robot as my senior science project, and it was fully remote controlled. So I've always had this interest, and consistent with the theme, I think the idea of stimulating interest in science and technology, the more seeds we can plant at a young age, the better off we'll be, because many of those seeds will sprout and become entrepreneurs in the STEM field. And I think that as they become self-confident in those areas, they will tend to swim upstream and maintain their focus. And we will probably lose a few, but by starting a lot of young people off early will really plow the field, so to speak, in terms of the number of successful entrepreneurs and in the STEM areas and being able to push our nation forward in technology. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama in the 60s. So you can imagine in 1968 in the South, during the heart of the Civil Rights Movement, when we were being told we can't attend certain universities. As a child, I grew up in the era where I had to ride at the back of the bus going downtown or going to school or other places. So it was really an era of harsh discrimination. And for me, that was just a way of life. I grew up with it, I accepted it, I didn't question it because it was just the way things were. But fortunately, I was able to maintain my focus on science and technology and to this point become a successful inventor and entrepreneur.
Well, it's a remarkable story. I want to pick up on a few things that you said, but first let me tell folks that just very recently it was announced that you will be inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 2022, which is rarefied space. Obviously, very few folks make it, but deservedly so. So congratulations for that. You and I spoke at some length, and we had a public program when I was at the PTO. And I remember one of the stories you told, and I think it's important for these purposes. As a child, one of your many achievements was blowing up your mother's kitchen. And that somehow, I do believe actually that is an important thing. Not that I recommend kids blowing up any parents' kitchens, but I do think that there is something in there about what makes an inventor. Can you touch upon that a little bit?
Sure. Well, when I was, I got interested when President Kennedy said we were going to put a man on the moon before the decade was out. I was about 12 years old at the time, and of course, very excited about the possibility of going to the moon. I got interested in science and rockets, and so I went to the library and learned how to found books on how to make rocket fuel. And one of the recipes required that you heat it. So I was literally in the kitchen and on my mother's stove mixing rocket fuel when it got out of control. And I saw a small spark, and then I knew I couldn't put it out. It started to shoot up. And so I had these tall flames shooting out of the pot in the kitchen. And I was really, really terrified. The smoke got so thick in the kitchen, you couldn't see your hands right in front of your face. It was so much. By the time it cleared, there were only a few small holes burnt in the kitchen chairs. So I didn't set the kitchen on fire, thank God, but I knew I was in trouble. I put on 2 pair of pants and was waiting on my dad to get home because I felt that I was going to get a spanking. I just knew it was going to happen. And he got home, he looked at me and he looked at what had happened. told me that I was going to have to mix my rocket fuel outside from that point on, and he bought me a hot plate. So this gets back to what I was saying about starting early. That could have been a terrifying experience for me if I had gotten severely punished to the point where I would have stayed away from some of the adventurous things and risks that I had been taking. But instead, I was not punished. And so I still have a tendency to take risk and pursue technology and delve into the unknown, if you will. So I think it's very important that we understand and nurture that curiosity and the thinking outside of the box, and not always look at kids as troublemakers just because they make a mistake.
Yeah, important lessons there for would-be inventors. And finally, before we go to the rest of the panelists, you did mention that you grew up in segregated South and had obviously lots and lots of issues to overcome to be where you are. Maybe you can take one more minute to touch on that a little bit, and because you did participate in this as a school age boy, did participate in this robotic competition, and you did win during a difficult time. Any lessons from that that we might be able to take in today's world to somehow try to break the logjam for diversity of innovation today?
Yeah, I think it just gets back to nurturing out of the box thinking, if you will. The robot that I showed you a picture of, that was in 1968. This science competition was at the University of Alabama, where just a few years earlier, Governor Wallace had stood in the door and insisted that no Black students would ever attend or register at that university. And of course, President Kennedy nationalized the National Guard and had the National Guard escort 2 students onto campus so they could indeed register. So this was an environment where we were not even expected to participate. We were the only Black students there. There were 3 of us from my high school. It was a competition for students in schools all over the Southeast US. So Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, all of the southern states were represented. And we did win first place. And fortunately, the judges were from industry and they had a broader perspective. And sometimes I think about Lonnie, my robot. I use my alter ego. I just could not be denied. What looks like eyes is actually a real tape recorder, because digital technology didn't exist back then. That was my way of programming him. I could transmit signals and have them recorded. He was fully remote controlled. That was my sister and brother's walkie-talkie they had gotten for Christmas. I hardwired it so I could get signals into the robot. So it was really a series of out-of-the-box solutions. But during that era, there are times when I literally feared for my life. Whites would come into our neighborhood and kidnap Blacks just to have fun with them and have mayhem. I can remember riding on my bike, fearful of being caught, being chased by whites. So I went through all of that. But fortunately, my interest in technology, as kids, we were entrepreneurs, because we would get together in our neighborhood and we'd come up with projects and things and games, and we would go off and just come up with goals, and we would build projects and have fun. We built go-karts, all kinds of things. So the entrepreneurial spirit was there, the out-of-the-box thinking was there, and it was just nurtured.
Yeah, great.
I will say also during my professional career, there are times when I would go into a new situation where people would look at me and have low expectations. And I would be very confident knowing that eventually, when they see me do my thing, I would be able to really win them over and have them very supportive. And so I never had a situation where, the things that were denied me, I would never accept the idea that it was the idea of racism and bigotry, because I felt that personally I would eventually overcome those things. And that's a personal goal. It's not something that comes easy. But I think that having had the successes I had as a young individual, that gave me the self-confidence to navigate through the negative environments that I would find myself into. Often the only Black, for example, professional person on staff at a company. and being looked down. I'll give you one example before I go. When I was co-oping in school, I co-opted Union Carbide, and I'd be walking through the plant with the clipboard in my hand and a pen, and as an industrial engineer doing time studies for manufacturing. And one of the workers, like, would call me over, whisper, come over, and tell me, I'm like, what's the big deal? What are they trying to tell me? What they're trying to let me know something. They would whisper to me that I need to get on one of those manufacturing lines, else I was going to get fired. Because they didn't have the idea that someone Black who looked like them could work in a professional role in a company. And they were trying to protect me from the consequences that they felt will eventually come my way. So it's literally an uphill battle in many, many situations. Being inducted into the Alabama Engineering Hall of Fame was a real personal victory and that was held at the University of Alabama. And so that was like coming full circle. I don't want to hog your time.
Yeah, no, those are fabulous stories. I often say that science, technology, and innovation in particular can be, if we give it a chance, the great equalizer in many different ways. But we need many more examples like you. Let me turn to Valencia, who is Deputy Commissioner for Patents at the USPTO, runs the National Council for Expanding American Innovation. And obviously, I want to hear from you, Valencia, on those specific issues. But before then, you yourself are an engineer, and obviously you're a woman and also minority. So you also probably have important stories to tell about your own ability to navigate this science and engineering field.
I do. Thank you so much, Andre, for inviting me here to speak with this distinguished panel. And yeah, I've shared with you before that you selecting me to help lead the formation of the council and the strategy is more than just an honor in my career, but personally, because of my background. I grew up not far from Lonnie in Louisiana. So growing up an African-American girl in the Deep South, I don't think many people surrounding me would have thought that at some point I would be the deputy commissioner of the USPTO with a law degree and a degree in engineering, electrical engineering. That's not necessarily the path that young African-American girls were told they were supposed to go. At that time in the late 60s and 70s when I grew up. But for people who saw in me, my parents, teachers, who saw in me something that at times I didn't even see in myself. I couldn't detect in myself my being inquisitive about science and technology and where that could lead, if not for opportunities that were given to me. If not for the education that I was geared towards, I would not be where I am today, which makes being part of the council, being part of building this strategy so much more important because it's helping me to give opportunities to people like me. And one of the things that Lonnie reminded me of when he was talking about some of his first opportunities in his career. In college, I did internships. So I went from Louisiana to Endicott, New York, upstate New York, doing a co-op with IBM. Great experience and actually helped gear my career in solid state devices. And I clearly remember someone who identified herself as my mentor. She decided she was going to be my mentor. And one of the things that she shared with me up front, being a African-American woman of a light complexion, she said, you could really steer away from letting people know that you are a Black woman. And I think it's going to help you in your career. And she thought she was helping me when she said that to me. She did not understand how that was what she was saying was harming not only my confidence in being an African American engineer and future lawyer in what I could do, being the person I am and what I represent. And I think part of what we're doing through the council, through the national strategy, everyone on this panel is bringing access, education, and opportunities to women, to all underrepresented, to people who grew up in a geographic area where those opportunities aren't necessarily there, and saying, because of who you are, because of what you represent and what you bring, we want to support you, lift you, help move you forward.
So with that, let me ask you about the National Council. If you think just a couple of minutes to say what it is and what's its ultimate goal.
So always enjoy talking about it, and I never miss an opportunity to say thank you to you for being the architect of this council, as well as the strategy that we're moving forward with. Now, the council was born out of, as you and Senator Hirono have mentioned, the Success Act report looking into identification of data for underrepresented women and other underrepresented groups, that something needed to be done. And this is part of what the USPTO from that report decided would be done. And it is to develop this council whose objective is to assist the USPTO in developing a national strategy on innovation and intellectual property, and developing a plan of action to foster the involvement of underrepresented groups as inventors, as patentees, as innovation leaders. So it is a group of, I'm proud to say, very, very impressive group of executives within industry, nonprofit organizations, academia, and various government departments that have come together to shine a light on what we're doing here, which is developing this strategy that's a roadmap for our community. Not only do we have a very impressive group of council members that include our own Lonnie and former council Lisa, but we also have a working group that sits under that council that's representatives from the companies and organizations of the council, which include our own Cordell here as a working group member, is helping the USPTO to put forth the best practices, to put forth the areas that are a gap in the development of underrepresented groups as inventors and patentees. Now, that strategy really it's a roadmap. The roadmap from the very beginning, as we've been discussing here, of an inventor's life, that moment 3 and 4 years old, where you see that they understand and comprehend what STEM is, what STEAM is, but not only the sciences and the engineering, but how to be an inventor in that space as well. And starting at that age, creating innovators and inventors, and moving throughout their entire academic career, not only in grade school, but high school, college, and beyond, helping with education on not only the brilliance of STEM and what it can do for us as individuals, but this nation, but also how to invent within that space. And go from there, the roadmap then moves to practicing innovation and what is required to really support, mentor, bring opportunities to inventors in order to move forward and realize that. Now, the next aspect of that roadmap that we're building is realizing. So once you actually have the patent, how do you then get the opportunities for the inventors to then realize through commercialization, through funding, and getting them to the right people? Not only the inventor and the innovator, but from the other side, each sector of our community, what's their responsibility in making this happen? And along the entire way, how do we measure our progress? not every organization, not every university or school or local community will be starting at the same space. You know, we have impressive group here who've been working in this this arena for quite some time and has had a great impact, but some people are starting from the beginning. It's giving them a maturity assessment that helps them understand where they are in this whole scheme of supporting and building innovators and inventors, and helping them to measure along the way as they're putting initiatives in place, building and getting stronger, and doing this as an IP and innovation community. We each do things individually with wonderful impact. But when you bring together a council and a working group and you educate and bring awareness as a collective, that impact is even greater and will get us to the point where we no longer have to use the term underrepresented or underserved.
Excellent. Thank you. I very much look forward to what the council will generate. Having concrete proposals is key. And obviously, that's one of your main goals. We'll come back to all of that, Valencia. Let me turn now to Lisa Jorgensen. And I want to focus on two main things. First, Lisa, your work at WIPO. Obviously, you have an international perspective now from where you're sitting now as Deputy Director General of WIPO, and maybe you can bring to the table best practices from around the world, even though issues of diversity and inclusiveness vary around the world, obviously, but maybe there are some common threads that you see. And then I separately want to talk to you about your past life a little bit at AIPLA and address some of the issues that go on in the among the attorney bar, IP bar, and Senator Hirono addressed that a little bit in her remarks. But let me start with WIPO. Tell us a bit about what you're doing at WIPO and what WIPO is doing when it comes to gender and diversity and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's where I got cut off. So I'll just continue with, in working with our member states and our stakeholders, it became even more obvious over the last couple of years, but certainly since I arrived here at the beginning of this year, that the IP and gender issues and the matters that were important to women in IP were taking on a much more fervent role, if you will, that we needed to address a lot of issues. So our Director General, Darren Tang, had asked if I would take on the IP and gender champion role for all of WIPO. And of course, I've been very passionate about IP and gender issues, and I said yes. And we'll be looking at a strategic direction on IP and gender matters for all of WIPO. Be responsible for implementing WIPO's gender-related strategic goals, which will include things like promoting and encouraging female engagement in IP, providing expertise and support services in the IP and gender issues to our member states, but also to other external stakeholders. So this is really on a worldwide basis. And we're going to be doing some of the basic but very important things like providing the necessary data and information to integrate what we will hope to see as a gender perspective into things like IP legislation, IP policies, programs, projects, etc. So in this new role for me, we'll be working in part of the strategic plan will be to include hiring our very first senior advisor for IP and gender. This person is going to work very closely with key stakeholders such as the IP offices around the world, the Geneva missions, the international organizations, NGOs, corporations, and inventors. This person will also act as the primary liaison with our member states on education, research, capacity building, and internally we're going to create and facilitate our what we're calling cross-sector programs, which is getting all of WIPO to work together in this area to amplify and enhance what we can do, giving access to the IP system for women inventors and innovators. So more specifically, we're going to be looking at ways to disaggregate data to identify women inventors. And I was very pleased at Senator Hirono's message on the IDEA Act, because this is obviously one of the key things that needs to be done. We'll be looking at ways to try to identify trends, patterns, and even obstacles for women to use the IP registration systems. We want to also work on programs that it can advance girls entering STEM fields, things like identifying grants and scholarships available to them, access to digital technology, and even things like funding and investment opportunities. We'll identify opportunities to integrate gender perspectives as we think is really going to be important into IP legislation and IP policies and programs.
Lisa, talking about data, some of the concerns about collecting data from inventors, whether it is demographic data, that is, whether it's in the United States or at WIPO as part of the PCT, that have been voiced, is that it might have a counterproductive effect. In other words, that some inventors, if they think that their gender will be identified or their race will be identified, some of them, for a variety of reasons, might think that might be disencouraged from applying. Do you see any validity to those concerns, and how would you address them?
Well, I would actually have to say that from the PCT perspective, so the patent application process at WIPO, we have not actually run into that scenario where at least we haven't been able to identify anyone, in my understanding yet, that has said they don't want to file a patent application because they don't want to be identified. Now, we know that for example, in the IDEA Act, that it's voluntary information being requested. Some countries have taken that a step further and are doing things like using a national identifier to people and asking them to use that national identifier, such as in Mexico, for example, to say, put that identifier in with their patent application so that they can be identified. But then what we're finding is a lot of the, at least in developing countries, but I think also in the developed countries, when we are able to then send that same information back to those countries that help them then put into place more robust policies for the benefit of women, I think people recognize that. So we're not actually running into that scenario as of yet. If we do, we'll let people know that. But so far, women have been not necessarily volunteering because they haven't had a mechanism to volunteer that data, but not objecting to it at this stage.
Yeah, of course, the IDEA Act is careful to say that the data that is to be provided not only is voluntary, but in addition to that, should be confidential and not made part of the prosecution record. So hopefully that help allay the concern that some folks have expressed. Before we go to Dr. Hardy, one more question for you, Lisa, and that's from the practitioner point of view. Since you did serve at AIPLA, which is I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but at least in the United States, is the largest intellectual property professionals organization. There definitely is more that needs to be done to increase diversity among the IP professional groups. Any thoughts about that, just from your AIPLA life, but also perhaps from WIPO, because these professionals also appear before WIPO in the PCT?
Sure. So, AIPLA has, I think, just looking at all of the various associations, one of the strongest committees on women in IP. And that is to really help the practitioner. So as you're saying, what do we do for practitioners? And finding ways to help them, not just with getting into college or getting into law school, but what happens then when they get out of law school? Where do they go? Trying to help them network to find positions and jobs, helping them understand what to expect when they get into a firm or into a corporation. But one of the amazing things that I found throughout my time at AIPLA and even before when I was a member of AIPLA, the number of people that come to the Women in IP committees, I would say not a majority, but a large portion of them are men. And I think that's absolutely critical to the success of a women in IP program, that you have the men supporting the program. So if you have senior partners in law firms, or you have senior managers in corporations who understand the concepts of promoting, mentoring, coaching, and even sponsoring the women lawyers, I think that they, and women practitioners, so patent agents as well, they have a better chance of being successful in their own careers.
Yeah, so hopefully some of those best practices get incorporated in whatever the council puts out or other documents. But there are studies that show that companies that have more diversity among their patent lawyers, whether in-house or outside patent counsel, have better success at generating invention disclosures from their diverse engineers and scientists. So, okay, well, that's good. All that's great stuff. Thank you very much, Lisa. And turning now to Dr. Hardy from 3M. To me, one of the key to finally breaking the logjam in diversity of innovation is the participation of corporations in the industry. There is no question that that's really where the vast majority of the action is, or has to be, because that's where most of the patent filings are generated by a large margin. More than, I forget the exact number, but well over 90% of patent applications that come to the USPTO, I think, Valencia can correct me, but I think more than 90% come from large companies and not smaller, small entities. So what is industry doing? What more can industry do? Because we see that effectively, at least from the women's study that we did at the PTO, Women Inventor study, women are filing at about half the rate. Women who are employed already are filing at about half the rate that their male counterparts are filing at in across industries. So it's not particular to any specific industry. Across industries, we see this 50% phenomena. So thoughts, Cordell?
Thank you. So I certainly will address the question, but I just want to first express gratitude for the opportunity to participate in this forum with the distinguished panel. I've been taking some notes as I've listened, some really important themes here to take back, even from a 3M and corporate perspective. 3M's tagline is science applied to life, and the inventive process is absolutely critical to our value model and how we create sustained competitive advantage for our product portfolios in the marketplace. In 2014, we reached our 100,000th granted patent, and as you mentioned, Director, in the 2020 study for Progress and Potential Report, 3M was highlighted as a leading company in advancing the participation of women in the inventive process. So we value the inventive process as a critical business process for 3M. And then we also value diversity and inclusion as a lever and a cultural enabler for us to maximize the performance of our workforce. And so there was a lot of commonality in listening to your discussion with Senator Hirono and some of the key themes that 3M has been focused on. If we don't have an inclusive, inventive environment, then we can't be competitive. That's just the reality. We can't recruit effectively. We can't maximize the performance of our technical and business community if we are leaving a significant share of our brain power outside of the process. And so that if we embrace that truth, then intellectual honesty sort of dictates some follow-on steps. So we put money, time, leadership, emphasis into trying to draw forward the participation of our entire community of researchers and other employees in the inventive process. Our CEO, Mike Roman, as we were talking about NCEAI, is a part of the council. And as Valencia was discussing, I'm happy to serve on the working group as well. So right from the top of the company down, this message around inclusiveness in the inventive process is really fundamental. Mentoring and coaching, manager training, it filters into our pipeline, how we recruit, the coaching that our supervisors get in managing diverse employees, and the need to try and have tailored leadership styles for individuals versus having a broad-based approach, all of it being important. As I was thinking about my role here and listening to the conversation, if you'll permit me a little discretion, there are two dimensions of my participation. One is as a technical leader at 3M Company, and 3M having a voice in this discussion around expanding American innovation and inventive capability. And the other is as an inventor personally, and an African-American male, and just thinking about some of the direct contributors to my own personal progress as a scientist and an inventor. It was very it was remarkable, I'll say. Your mention of the glue stick as a key 3M product. I listened to the earnings call from Mike Roman and our CFO, and I don't think they would consider that a key product. So
it was not included? It was
no,
not.
I don't think that was.
Well, we have to have a separate conversation.
I don't think that was highlighted in the discussion. I'll have to go back and look at the notes. It was key for me as my first patent, and the opportunity to go through the conception process and going not just from the patenting activity, but scaling up in the manufacturing facility and working with marketers, talking about claims, looking at packaging, the whole commercialization process. That was fundamental for me personally. But going back even before that, you heard from Lonnie the touch point with his father, where he made what might be considered a mistake, and it was treated as a learning opportunity. And his dad had the insight to protect his creativity and initiative, and to actually help him to iterate to be more effective next time. There's something to say about the role that family structure and the parenting process plays in nurturing innovators. And then on to the education process. For me, I went to college, but I didn't have much in the way of funding. And so 3M, the company for which I now work, where I have had a chance to invent and participate in the commercialization process, helped with internships and scholarship funding. I was an NSF student. I was a National Achievement Scholar. So these funding mechanisms are an important part of the discussion. If we're thinking about expanding American innovation and the diversity of innovation, it's necessary that underrepresented, underfunded, under-resourced groups have some way to access the support to go and get trained so that they can be effective. And maybe on that point, back to Senator Hirono's comment, inclusion and innovation is a critical national competitiveness issue. And so just the same as 3M is fundamentally aware we can't leave much of our brainpower behind, it's great to hear the discussion at the national level within the Senate that we can't leave much of our national brainpower behind and hope to be competitive on the global scale. But if we embrace that as a fact and as a truthful statement, then there's some follow-on consequences around how we resource students to be trained in STEM and in the education funding mechanisms. If we are tied to the idea of using property taxes to fund the public education department in schools, then the likelihood is that advantaged populations are going to have more resourcing in their schools than disadvantaged populations. So if this zero-sum game of having wealthy neighborhoods have wealthy schools, we can predict the results, right? And so it's one thing for us to just say we recognize that it's necessary to have an inclusive innovation ecosystem, but there are some very clear quantitative steps that we can take at the national level to drive some changes in short order. But there's not going to be a free lunch in this regard. It is going to cost, and And so that's something else that I hope that we can keep discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll ask the organizers here to put all the panelists up. I don't know if that's possible, share the screen, but while they're doing that, and I have you, Cordell, you know, the main study, one of the more recent studies actually on the innovation economy does show that it's not just racial or gender inequality that affects the innovation ecosystem. It's also economic, and it does, I mean, some of these things are overlapping, right? The issues are overlapping to some extent, but nevertheless, even if you have a pure white male-dominated community that is economically disadvantaged, the Harvard study that I just mentioned shows that they innovate at a significantly lower rate than the average. Part of the reasons that you have just mentioned about sourcing of funding for education and the like. But beyond that, clearly, you know, the gender and racial diversity issues come through in the Harvard study and others.
For sure.
The PTO study as well. So what I'm interested in hearing from the group is, you know, now some specific potential recommendations, given the time, if you can pick one each. Cordell just mentioned something which I think is super interesting, and that is specific funding, presumably for STEM education, you meant, Cordell, or maybe for innovation education and the like. So that's one thing for policymakers to think about. But let me go to the rest of the panelists. You did mention also, Cordell, and maybe I'll turn it over to Lonnie as well, which is, you know, his parents didn't punish him for nearly blowing up the kitchen, but then there's a lesson in that in parenting. But isn't there a lesson in that in corporate America too? In other words, what about corporations having more of an environment where failure is okay? How can you be a successful inventor without failing and being okay with that failure, so you can get back up and try it again and again and again, because it takes a long time, obviously, to invent something, usually. Thoughts about that, Lonnie, about just more of the economic culture beyond parenting when it comes to tolerance for failure?
You're on mute, Lonnie.
Lonnie, you're on mute. Lonnie, you're on mute.
No wonder it was hard for me to break in.
There you go.
I'm anxious to comment on Cordell's remarks, because he's right on, you know, and we talked about the idea that, you know, how do you target an individual group for innovative resources and resources to allow and enable them to innovate. I don't think there's any challenge in recognizing the depressed regions, areas, even segments of cities, and our ability to target those location hub zones, for example. You can target those, put resources in, and color those resources to stimulate innovation, tax credits and things like that, for example, that are targeted for R&D activities that will motivate people to innovate. One of the things I will real anxious to mention, I had an experience. I get people contacting me all the time about ideas that they have. This is one that came from a small kid. I don't know if you could see it, but it's for a super soaker. So we've got kids, people who got these ideas, and they're very young, but they're also older people. I was contacted by an individual who invented door cameras that you could use your cell phone to see who's at your door. But he is not part of this wave, this huge industry that has evolved based on door cameras and being able to monitor people come to the door. But he was one of the first to get a patent. And I had a similar experience. I have, you know, my digital distance measuring instrument, my first patent, you know, that was for digital encoders as well as the base technology for DVDs and CDs, but I never really got earned any royalties on those inventions. When I asked this individual who really was upfront with this idea, he got his patent and everything. How did he come up with this idea? And he told me that, you know, Well, someone had come to his door. He opened the door without really realizing or knowing who it was, and they shot him in the face. Someone was trying to break, and he was blind. So I should have said that up front. How does a blind person come up with an idea for a door camera that you can see who's at your door? In any case, he had gotten shot in the face, and that's why he was blind. I'm helping him pursue his invention at this point and trying to collect royalties from it. But that leads me to this whole idea of tax credits. If large companies receive tax credits for royalties that they pay to individual inventors, they would be less motivated to shut them out and avoid paying royalties to those individuals. It could create a win-win scenario, and you could actually have more small individual inventors coming up with ideas and receiving benefits, and that would allow them to continue to invent, which is how I became successful, because I did get a deal where I got enough income to support my desire to invent. But typically companies avoid, and they're motivated to avoid paying royalties. You end up having to sue and all these other things to get them to pay. But if they have a legitimate scenario where they have some tax credit, if they're paying royalties to an individual small inventor, that could be a huge motivator to stimulate more individuals to invent.
Thanks, Lonnie. Valencia, from the government's perspective, perhaps even more narrowly from an IP office's perspective, the U.S. PTO's perspective, any additional thoughts other than the National Council itself, which is doing its important work? Beyond that, anything else that might, or even who knows if it might work, but anything else that might be done to break the logjam?
Absolutely. We spoke about it quite a bit so far with the IDEA Act coming. You have to volunteer data, right? That's the applicant would have to volunteer. That's in any case, right? We cannot mandate this, but the sharing of data is pivotal. Having a platform where not only applicants, but every organization, every sector of our community, our IP community, our innovation community, sharing their data, identifying within their own organizations, as well as whoever they reach out to, where they are in embracing inclusiveness, identifying it, sharing it. That gives us the impact. That helps us to understand better where to reach out. As you were mentioning with geographic and economic, we have to know where those pockets are. From the little bit of data that we have and we know of right now, when you look at the mapping of our country and then look at where patents are actually awarded every year, and you cross that with the demographics of those regions, there are vast deserts in our country where underrepresented groups in these populated regions of our country we're not reaching out to. Having that data to help us identify those areas, coming together as a collective, government, industry, legal firms, universities, to reach out to those areas to educate. So access to education and opportunities, but first identifying where they are in this country and then concentrating our efforts in a collective to do such.
The patent system, well, all IP systems, but the patent system in general is complex. It's complex to navigate. Patents are complex, the laws are complex, and so on. And first comers might be discouraged by the complexity, especially if they don't have a mentoring system. And obviously folks from underrepresented communities have less of a mentoring structure by definition than average. Anything that the PTO can do, or in combination with the Department of Commerce or anyone else, to break that logjam, to either through mentorship networks or simplifying the issues, maybe even lower fees, even lower than what we have now, and so on.
Absolutely. So you're hitting on quite a few. I hate to take all the rest of our time, but you're absolutely right, Andre. As the USPTO, we're there to lead these efforts of helping to develop the networks. We have great programs like our pro bono program, the law schools clinics, some events that we have to share data.
We lost Valencia. Maybe she'll get back on. But you're not getting away with it, Lisa, given even though we are at the bottom of the hour of the program, so to speak. Maybe you'll have the last words. Any specific proposals or thoughts that you see from an international scale that might be applicable? And by the way, IP is an international thing, right? Half of the applications at the USPTO come from overseas anyway. At least currently. But anyway, so any specific thoughts as potential solutions?
Sure, thanks, Andre. So just very quickly, first, so I won't go into detail. I will second what Valencia was saying about the sharing of the data itself, bringing policymakers together with the technical experts, the businesses, and the communities. That's very critical. But to share the data, you have to have the data. So from a WIPO perspective, one of the key things that we do work on is finding out how to obtain the data that makes sense. What is accurate and timely? You can do your self-identification, but a lot of inventors are not going to give you that data voluntarily necessarily. We hope they will, but not necessarily. You can attribute, have attribution based on secondary sources, unique identifiers, like I mentioned with Mexico using national ID numbers. But you can also have attribution to the gender based on titles or naming customs, like Mr., Mrs., Julio, Julia, things like that. Or even what we think is one of the sort of best practices is our World Gender Name Dictionary, which is a collection of given names and their most commonly associated gender. This is something that WIPO believes is going to be a best practice. We have gone out. We actually have it's a free public resource that provides over about 26 million unique name country pairings, taking into consideration almost 100 languages. And so we will continue to work on this, and we'll continue to improve it so that everybody will ultimately have access to this World Gender Naming Dictionary to help us identify who the inventors are.
Well, that's some great thoughts there. Valencia, welcome back. Anything else you wanted to add before you went out for a second?
Thanks. Dropped out for a minute. Sorry about that. So yeah, the USPTO, in collaboration with organizations to bring together the networks, as I was mentioning, pro bono and the law school clinics, having them work together so that when one does their successful, hopefully, pro bono, getting a patent for an inventor or from a law school clinic, we can move over to connecting them with experienced inventors, experienced, small business owners on how to take on the next step. Those mentoring and networks for the inventors, for the legal system, are key, because you're right. It's a complex system. It's the integration of technology with law. There's nothing simple about that. So for an independent inventor, someone who's just getting started, it's key that they have the support system to help navigate through the USPTO. We are looking to build an innovation portal that will allow the first-time users or more seasoned users of the system to be able to build a profile for themselves of where they are as an inventor. And then that will readily be able to allow us to point them to the right references and resources, both inside and outside of the USPTO.
Well, I think that really could be super helpful, and I think it can help even non-independent inventors, but folks within companies who, for whatever reason, don't have built-in mentorship structures. They can get help from something like this. Well, we're over time. I want to thank all four of you for some great thoughts, a fabulous discussion. We're going to continue these discussions. Obviously, this will take A lot of work from a lot of folks to figure out, but I'm very thankful for all of your leadership. Each one of you in your own way are making tremendous contributions to this really important issue. Thank you all. Thanks again to CSIS for hosting us, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Hey.